Part 4. Essay number 63. Outline 5 characteristics of colonial education in Africa. 1. Colonial education in Africa tended to be highly elitist, with a focus on producing an educated elite class that could serve the needs of the colonial government. 2. The curriculum was often heavily biased towards Western ideas and values, with little recognition given to traditional African knowledge or culture. 3. The language instruction usually favored European languages such as English or French, over local indigenous languages. 4. Education was also used by colonial powers as a means of spreading their influence, particularly through religious teachings, those schools which were run by missionaries. 5. Finally, while some attempts were made to promote basic literacy among population, these initiatives had slow progress due lack funding and resources being devoted more prestigious activities such training civil servants. 64. Analyze 6 causes of the Second World War. 1. The Treaty of Versailles. This treaty imposed harsh sanctions on Germany following their defeat in World War I, which led to widespread resentment among the German people and helped create an environment conducive to war. 2. Nazi aggression. Adolf Hitler's expansionist policies towards Eastern Europe were a major contributing factor to the outbreak of World War II as he sought to expand German territory by force. 3. The rise of fascism. Mussolini's Italy, as well as other fascist regimes that rose during this period such as Japan and Spain, contributed to an atmosphere of hostility and paranoia in Europe that would eventually lead to war. 4. Appeasement. Britain and France's weak response towards Nazi aggression made them appear weak, thus leading Hitler believe he could act with impunity without fear retaliation from allies. 5. Expansionism and imperialism. Several nations sought expanding their power beyond already existing borders with military force, believed it was necessary to increase international prestige. 6. Nationalism and mobilization. Nationalistic fervor spread throughout many countries prior World War II, fueling competition between states. They increased size military forces, prepare for potential conflict. 65. Colonial social services. Consolidate colonialism in Africa. Justify this statement by giving 6 examples. 1. Colonial social services were designed to benefit the colonial powers rather than local African communities, thus creating a sense of dependency on the colonial government which consolidated their authority in Africa. 2. Colonial education systems served to spread European values and cultures among Africans, further legitimizing the presence of colonial rule in Africa. 3. The introduction of Western medicine and healthcare infrastructure helped reduce mortality rates, increased longevity which allowed for greater growth population under colonialism. 4. Expansion. Public works such roads and railways enabled colonists better access resources and transportation goods made easier across disparate regions they controlled. 5. The establishment churches by missionaries strengthened ties between African people and Europeans as well. Religious indoctrination associated with these institutions inculcated obedience rulers. 6. Finally, taxation policies introduced by colonizers gave them direct control over local economies as collected revenue from taxes was used to fund military campaigns, other activities that benefited colonial interests. 66. Elaborate 6 causes of political instability in Africa. 1. Poor governance. The lack of strong democratic institutions and a culture of corruption have undermined the stability of many African nations, leading to widespread political instability in the region. 2. Inequality. Social and economic disparities between different ethnic groups have led to conflicts and unrest which destabilize governments. 3. Armed conflict. Long-running civil wars and regional conflicts often create an environment where it is difficult for governments to effectively govern their countries or maintain stability. 4. Ethnic tension. Deep-rooted tribal divisions can lead clashes, violence, as well outbreaks, riots challenging existing power structures. 5. Economic mismanagement. The mismanagement of resources by government officials has created dire economic conditions in many African states, resulting in public discontent which can quickly devolve into political instability. 6. Poor infrastructure. Lack basic infrastructure such roads, electricity, Water and sanitation further hinder development, creating environments conducive to political upheaval. 67. With examples, explain 6 reasons for African resistance to colonial rule. 1. Social and cultural disruption. Colonizers imposed foreign laws and customs upon the African people, which often clashed with existing social norms and practices, leading to resistance from locals. 2. Exploitation of resources. The wealth of African countries was exploited by colonial rulers for their own benefit, thus creating a sense of injustice amongst native populations who saw little benefit from colonialism. 3. Political oppression. Colonial rule was inherently oppressive as natives had few rights or freedoms while being subject to arbitrary decisions made by distant authorities. 4. Forced labor. Many Africans were subjected unpaid labor on plantations or in mines, leading uprisings against these injustices such as Zimbabwe's first Chimurenga in 1896. 5. Religious suppression. Missionary activities intended spread Christianity resulted cultural hegemony over traditional religions, leading pushback religious fundamentalists. 6. Taxation without representation. Local taxes were introduced fund infrastructure projects but with no representation, voice grievances regarding their implementation. 68. Analyse 6 tactics used by the colonialists to establish colonial economy in Africa. 1. Forced labor. Colonialists often imposed taxes that led to the use of forced labor by Africans on plantations, mines and other colonial projects. 2. Land confiscation. Colonial governments confiscated native land for their own economic benefit, leading to widespread poverty and deprivation among rural populations. 3. Taxation. Local taxes were frequently levied natives in order to fund colonial administrators' government activities or infrastructure projects, resulting further economic hardship locals. 4. Monopoly control. By forcing local farmers purchase supplies from them at higher prices than market rate, colonists sought secure monopolies over certain resources and industries, thus limiting competition, increase profits. 5. Export promotion. The extraction natural resources such gold, diamonds was encouraged maximize profits through exports these commodities outside region. 6. Migration. Large numbers laborers were recruited move colonies work plantations where they could be exploited unpaid wages, low living conditions. 69. The United Nations Organization UNO has some political, social, and economic gains to Tanzania. Discuss this statement by giving 6 points. 1. Political. The UNO provides a platform for Tanzania to engage in international dialogue and diplomacy, as well as participate in regional peacekeeping initiatives. 2. Social. Through its various programs and initiatives, the UNO has supported Tanzania's efforts towards improving public health by providing healthcare services, nutrition assistance and clean water access to those who are most vulnerable or underserved. 3. Economic. The UNO has provided financial resources to assist with economic development projects such as infrastructure investments, job creation through microfinance schemes, poverty reduction strategies and agricultural reforms to enhance food security. 4. Education. The organization has also been instrumental in supporting educational activities that promote literacy skills among children as well as advocate for better learning standards for all age groups within the country. 5. Human rights protection. Through its agencies like UNHCR, the UNO supports protection of basic human rights and freedoms citizens regardless status. 6. Gender equality. By advocating equal opportunities women-men, promoting education female students and funding gender equality programs, the United Nations works bring parity genders across countries including Tanzania. 70. Outline 5 significances of Berlin Conference. 1. Legitimized colonialism. The Berlin Conference established the legal framework for European colonization in Africa, legitimizing their claims on African resources and territories. 2. Divided up territories. The conference also set out clear rules regarding the borders between different colonial powers' territories in Africa. 3. Established trade routes by regulating navigation of rivers and creation free trade zones, Berlin Conference facilitated development transportation systems, better access markets. 4. Strengthened diplomatic relations. Through negotiating treaties agreements, representatives participating European nations were able to strengthen diplomatic ties each other, which helped enhance global stability. Time. 5. Sparked conflict. Unfortunately, legacy Berlin Conference was also spark series territorial disputes, uprisings across continents since boundaries had been arbitrarily drawn without consideration local communities. 71. Explain 6 prerequisites for state formation in pre-colonial Africa. 1. Political leadership. Pre-colonial African states typically had strong political leadership, usually in the form of a monarch or other chief who held military and religious power over their territories. 2. Centralized government. To maintain order and authority within pre-colonial African societies, there was often some form of centralized government structure to provide laws, regulations and justice to its citizens. 3. Social structure. In many cases, rigid social hierarchies were established from which political institutions and laws derived. This type caste system helped unify people under one ruling class while also preserving cultural traditions. 4. Economic autonomy. Many pre-colonial African states attained economic independence through taxation systems, agricultural production structures that allowed them self-sustainability without relying on external resources. 5. Religion. Religion played an important role in many pre-colonial African societies. Oftentimes it provided the basis for belief systems upon which state formation took place, as well as mechanisms ensure loyalty rulers among citizens. 6. Military strength. As with most civilizations, military strength was essential, maintaining control and defending borders against enemies such European powers during colonization period. 72. Identify 6 factors which determined the variation of agricultural systems during the colonial period. 1. Geography. The geography of the area in which colonial powers were operating had a major influence on the type of agricultural system developed, as different climates and soil types necessitated different forms of agriculture. 2. Plantation system. Many colonial powers introduced large-scale plantation systems, where monocropping was practiced and landowning elites held control over labor and resources. 3. Technology. Improved technology allowed for greater production efficiency by introducing mechanization and chemical use farms. 4. Market access. Colonial government policies favored certain crops-based market demand, focusing more heavily cash crop exports than food production local populations. 5. Labor division. Colonial administrations often implemented unequal divisions labor between African women men in order to maximize available workforce and naturalize gender roles historically established within societies. 6. Export trade control. Through controlling export trade, colonial governments were able to manipulate profits made off African commodities while simultaneously perpetuating their power dominance. 73. Elaborate 6 consequences of Ngoni migration into East Africa in the 19th century. 1. Warfare and political conflict. The Ngoni migration into East Africa resulted in increased warfare between different ethnic groups as they competed for resources and power. This political unrest destabilized the region, leading to a period of civil wars and instability. 2. Cultural displacement. As the Ngoni forcefully migrated through various territories, they imposed their cultural practices while displacing the existing cultures of these regions. This often led to forced assimilation of local customs and rituals by those living under their rule or expulsion from these lands altogether. 3. Social change. The introduction of new social norms and values brought on by the Ngoni had an impact on gender roles, family dynamics, educational opportunities, economic systems etc. within societies it encountered. 4. Economic impact. Through taxation policies and trade initiatives implemented during their migrations, the Ngoni were able to influence regional economics significantly. Their presence also encouraged development infrastructure such roads which enabled greater exchange goods services. 5. Environmental changes in some areas where large-scale farming was introduced, for example deforestation occurred or make way plantations, other agricultural activities resulting drastic changes landscape environment as whole. 6. Religious influence. It is believed that during this time when polytheism still prevalent among many African tribes prior contact with Europeans, traditional beliefs were somewhat modified, incorporate elements Christianity, which later became main religion practiced much East African population today. 74. Analyze 6 problems facing African countries that originated from their colonial heritage. 1. Resource exploitation. Colonial powers often established economic structures that were designed to benefit their own interests and created a reliance on foreign imports, leaving African countries vulnerable to exploitation of their natural resources and labor. 2. Political fragmentation. Many African colonies were artificially divided into distinct territories during the colonial period, leading to political fragmentation within the region due to competing claims over land or resources. This has hampered post-colonial unity and progress in many areas of Africa. 3. Cultural legacy. Colonizing forces aimed to impose their own language, culture and religious beliefs upon those they colonized, which resulted in a legacy of cultural suppression for many Africans living today. 4. Economic dependence. After colonialism, most African nations became heavily reliant foreign aid investments or to maintain economies, thus hindering potential growth, self-sufficient development. 5. Social inequality. The legacy institutionalized racism experienced during colonization still manifests itself today, forms inequality amongst different ethnic communities and social classes when it comes access educational opportunities, healthcare services, etc. 6. Structural violence. Decades authoritarian rule. Military coups have had devastating impacts across continent, resulting violence, displacement, countless numbers people, particularly women, children, who are often targeted disproportionately. These conflicts. 75. With concrete examples from various parts of Africa, assess 8 factors that determined the forms of decolonization in Africa. 1. Economic conditions. The financial and economic resources available to the newly independent African countries played a significant role in determining their paths of decolonization. Countries with larger economies, such as Nigeria and South Africa, were able to invest more into post-independence infrastructure projects that allowed them to control their own destinies. 2. Regional conflicts. Conflict between different nations or regions within Africa often disrupted efforts at peaceful decolonization, resulting in extended periods of unrest or outright war between the former colonies and their colonial rulers. Examples include the Algerian War of Independence 1954–1962, and the Angolan War for Independence 1975–2002. 3. International pressure. Many colonizers were forced to abandon their African territories due to international pressure from Cold War powers such as the United States or USSR, who wanted access to strategic ports or trade routes for geopolitical reasons. 4. Ideological change. After World War II, anti-colonial sentiment grew amongst many European nations, which resulted in an increased willingness by imperial powers to grant independence movements greater autonomy over their own affairs. 5. Domestic resistance movements. Grassroots resistance movements across Africa pushed for greater freedom from foreign rule throughout post-war period, culminating several successful independence campaigns such as those led by Nelson Mandela and Patrice Lumumba. 6. Diplomatic negotiations. In some cases, negotiations between colonizer representatives, native government officials facilitated smoother transition sovereignty without resorting violence conflict. Notable examples include India's process partition 1947, Ghana's Gold Coast granted 1957 respectively. 7. Social factors. Decolonization also depended upon changing attitudes among citizens regarding colonial rule, its long-term effects on social economics environment. Previously subjugated countries made up various ethnic religious backgrounds, all which played part, shaping respective nation-states after they obtained sovereignty. 8. Military interventions. When diplomatic options failed, Military intervention sometimes necessary liberate people living under oppressive regimes like French Algeria, Portuguese Angola, where wars waged secure total liberation, sometime leading even further complications. Occupation other areas neighboring region. These interventions had major implications. Development each country involved. Civil strife lasted decades afterwards. 76. Analyze 4 causes and 4 effects of the Second World War on Africa. One of the causes of the Second World War in Africa was the colonization by European powers. The Europeans had colonized much of Africa, including Algeria, Morocco and parts of what is now Ethiopia. This led to tensions between Europe and local people as well as economic exploitation that eventually caused war. Another cause for World War II in Africa was a power struggle among European countries over resources. They competed for control over important regions such as North and South Rhodesia, Angola, Cameroon and Mozambique, which all became battlegrounds during World War II. The third cause of the Second World War in Africa was ideological differences between European nations who were vying for supremacy on the continent while also wanting to spread their ideologies across it. Nazi Germany's expansionist policies towards other African countries posed a direct threat to their sovereignty, which resulted into armed conflicts with other colonial powers like France or Britain who opposed them. A fourth cause was racial hatred, which grew amongst certain groups living in areas with large concentrations of different ethnicities due to religious, political or social disputes between them leading up to World War II. The effects that followed were devastating. Millions died from combat fighting or famine. Some territories underwent changes from colonial rule into independent states. Economies suffered greatly due to inflation, lack resources, displacement population. Many refugees fled dangerous conflict zones neighboring countries seeking safety. Additionally, post-World War II period saw rise nationalist movements calling end oppressive colonization, foreign occupation result, new wave independence struggles. Decades come more recently, these have manifested forms violence, civil unrest, further destabilizing region. 77. Account for 6 reasons that led to the scramble for and partition of Africa in the second half of the 19th century. The scramble for and partition of Africa in the second half of the 19th century was driven by a number of factors. The first factor was the desire from Europe to assert control over more lands, particularly due to the Industrial Revolution that had begun taking place in Europe, leading them to seek new sources of raw materials for their factories. The second factor was competition amongst colonial powers. As each European country sought out new colonies, it incited rivalries among them as they competed for resources and land ownership in different parts of Africa. Thirdly, there were religious motivations behind colonization. Christian missionaries felt a duty to civilize African cultures by spreading Christianity throughout the continent, while many European countries saw this as an opportunity to extend their own political influence at home and abroad through missionary work. Fourthly, advances made in navigation technology allowed Europeans to travel further than ever before, which helped facilitate their travels into unexplored regions such as those within Africa, providing them with access points into previously unknown areas, where they could then establish trade networks or military bases. Fifthly, advances made in weaponry enabled Europeans' armies easily overpower local African tribes when attempting to take control certain territories. Finally, development imperialism encouraged some European nations boost national prestige while providing justification imperialistic policies. This created complex network alliances. Strategic interests propelled scramble, partitioning Africa between competing colonial regimes. 78. Analyze 8 impacts of coastal-based long-distance trade system on social, political and economic development of East African societies during the 19th century. The coastal-based long-distance trade system had a significant impact on the social, political and economic development of East African societies during the 19th century. The first impact was an increase in regional power dynamics, as some communities gained access to goods that enabled them to dominate their neighbors through superior military technology. This led to larger states with more complex hierarchical systems being established in parts of East Africa. The second impact was increased urbanization and diversification of economies as new forms of production and consumption developed out of the long-distance trading networks. This helped create larger cities which acted as hubs for commerce in certain regions, helping connect different ethnic groups together economically and culturally. Thirdly, there were large increases in foreign investment into local markets due to increased demand for imported goods such as guns and textiles from Europe or India. These investments allowed some elites within society to become even wealthier while opening up employment opportunities for those living at lower income levels who could no longer directly barter with each other but instead became reliant on cash incomes brought by outside traders. Fourthly, it created pathways migration, both voluntary slaves. Merchant networks served transmission channels between areas where labor resources were readily available, those willing pay premium price this type work. Fifthly, introduction wage labor-led development, capitalist relations production. Sixth, developments transportation technologies. Seventh, globalization, modern banking practices. Last, advances communication facilitated multiple simultaneous exchange processes. Different components trade systems. 79. Elaborate 6 ways in which the Zanzibar Revolution brought positive changes in the living conditions of the people of Isles. The Zanzibar Revolution brought positive changes to the living conditions of its people in several ways. First, it abolished slavery from the islands and freed thousands of slaves, allowing them to work for wages or pursue their own enterprises. This greatly improved their access to economic opportunities and increased their freedom. Second, it created a more equitable distribution of wealth by providing free education, land reform initiatives and giving greater rights to women. This allowed many previously disadvantaged citizens to gain access to resources that were previously denied them. Thirdly, religious tolerance was established through spiritual reforms which opened up avenues for different denominations as well as non-religious beliefs such as atheism and agnosticism. These reforms helped create a more inclusive society where everyone felt welcomed regardless of faith or cultural background. Fourthly, new laws were introduced which ensured better health care standards for all citizens. Improved sanitation initiatives combined with campaigns against diseases like malaria led to much lower morbidity rates in many parts of the island nation. Fifthly, infrastructure projects such as roads and ports connected many villages together while improving trade ties with mainland Africa, further boosting local economies. Last but not least, labor unions formed during this period offered critical protection against exploitation on both plantations and docksides, thus safeguarding workers' basic rights far better than before the revolution had occurred. 80. Examine 8 challenges of non-aligned organization. Non-aligned movement NAM face several challenges in their mission of promoting global peace and security. First, the organization is made up of nations from different geographical areas with varying levels of economic development, making it difficult for all members to have an equal voice in matters related to foreign policy or international disputes. Second, NAM does not have a political structure that allows for effective enforcement or implementation of decisions taken by the organization. Therefore, countries may choose to ignore any measures agreed upon without consequence. Thirdly, as its primary focus was on countering Cold War blocs, issues such as climate change or energy security are not given enough attention, which further limits its ability to deal with contemporary challenges. Fourthly, there has been a decline in membership due to some states shifting towards other blocs like NATO, leading fewer resources and ideas being available at NAM conferences. Fifthly, links between member countries remain weak, meaning that solidarity among them can be hard come by in times of crisis. Sixthly, many non-aligned countries suffer from poor governance. This makes meaningful collaboration within organization more difficult to achieve. Seventh, many developing countries lack capacity offering assistance other parts world where needed, and last but least, their military powers blocking access certain regions world, thereby limiting NAM's effectiveness responding emergencies, thus diminishing confidence body across globe. 81. The independence of Ghana of 1957 strengthened the struggle for independence for other African states. Justify by giving 6 relevant points. The independence of Ghana in 1957 strengthened the struggle for independence of other African states in several ways. First, it demonstrated that European colonial powers could be successfully challenged and defeated by an organized effort with a united front. This gave impetus to nationalist movements across the continent as they realized that gaining freedom was indeed possible. Second, it provided a beacon of hope and inspiration to people who had been oppressed under colonial rule for generations. The success of Ghana's revolution inspired grassroots organizing among people all over Africa who wanted to break free from oppressive regimes. Thirdly, Ghana's successful example set a precedent for other African